This is Dialogue. Dialogue, a presentation of the Public Affairs and Special Events Department of KLRB News. Once again, our continuing dialogue with Mae Brussell, political research specialist. Dialogue, assassination. Well, Mae, you know, a lot of people ask, aren't you worried for your life? Aren't you worried you're coming out with all this stuff? And if it's true, how long are they going to let you continue and all that sort of thing? Do you ever get any harassment or anything?
Bob, why did you bring that subject up?
Well, because we record these programs. They're pre-recorded. We record them on Tuesday of each week.
Yes.
And then they don't get on the air till Saturday. And on last week's program, you said something about that you weren't going to pay your income tax until such and so conditions were met. And before that program got on the air, the International Revenue Service was checking into your tax record. Now, how could that happen?
Well, you know, you were talking, you bring up this subject, we go on the air, and do I feel safe? And I think one day we should do a whole dialogue on that. And I have just spent the last 12 hours or so with my family who are visiting me from Southern California. And my parents have been not disagreeing with anything I say or my research or the reasons for my doing it, but they are so afraid that I'll be killed. And we've had this dialogue going back and forth in my home all evening, last night and this morning before I came in. So your ESP, we haven't discussed it when I came in, but this has been the running conversation, and I wanted my father to be a guest on the show. I said, will you come in with us and do a dialogue? He had his own radio show all up the state of California for 35 years and is prominent in Los Angeles. And I said, would you do a dialogue on my show, be a guest on my show? And of course he wouldn't. He wouldn't come in. And his fear, his big fear, is that I will be killed. And I said, if I get a letter that says stop today, I will stop. But I feel that everybody's life is in danger in this country, most people's lives, that we are headed towards the kind of treatment that Germany got. First killings inside by the government, and then we'll get, I've said before, people from other shores will come in and free those that are left and imprisoned, because this system is coming down heavy, and after 72 it's going to get more oppressive. And we've talked about fear of life. As far as the Internal Revenue, I said last week that I would not pay my taxes this year until the National Archives is opened up and until I have access to the information of who killed John Kennedy, because he was elected by a majority and I was a registered Democrat, and I didn't elect Walter Rostow or McGeorge Bundy. They didn't run for president. And I didn't elect Lyndon Johnson either. He was selected on that ticket to get the electoral votes of Texas.
I don't recall voting for Kissinger or Robert Helm.
We didn't vote for Kissinger or Helm or any of that team or John Connally. And I feel that the evidence of who committed the murders of the legally elected president should be available to everybody. So I'm withholding my taxes. And we went on the air on Saturday, and we made this tape Tuesday morning last week. Thursday, the Internal Revenue was at my ex-husband's store. We got a divorce 2 years ago. And they came and wanted all of the papers that he has and the divorce agreements and how much money I'm getting. And they would be back. They made their appearance with the Internal Revenue. And what does Mrs. Brussell have? What do you give her? We have talked about agents in residence at every radio station, at every newspaper in the country. It doesn't matter who it is. The tape was made on Tuesday, and Thursday the Internal Revenue was there.
But the main point is that program did not go on the air until Saturday.
Until Saturday.
And yet, the Thursday before that, they were checking into your tax records.
They're doing their homework. I got a phone call at the station.
That wasn't too cool. They should have at least waited until Monday or Saturday afternoon or 15 minutes after the program went off the air or something like that.
Well, they just went on down and started doing their
2 days before the program went on the air.
They were
already reacting to it.
That's right. I got a call this week from some fellows at a serviceman's club, young men, talking about the assassination, and this generation is supposed to have forgotten what happened, but luckily, because of your radio station and my research, we can keep people alive to the history of their times, even though those who committing these crimes want us to forget it. So one of the young fellows called the station, and then you called me, and he wanted to know who Oswald's lawyer was. They were having a discussion, and I made the point that Oswald never went to trial. He was killed. But one of the fellows remembered some lawyer that represented him. And I said that when Oswald was arrested, he asked for the name of John Apt. That was given to him by his intelligence agents that he worked with. And John Apt was a lawyer for the Communist Party in New York. And he was supposedly going to seek the help of Apt. Apt wouldn't even answer back or respond to this call at all.
Well, that was to
tie in
the suspicion that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of a communist conspiracy.
That's right. And then and Apt knew he didn't want to get in on this thing at all, and didn't even answer. And 2 days later, Oswald was dead, so that they could say, see, he had the name of a communist lawyer. The lawyer didn't fall for it, but the fellow who was talking had in his mind that Oswald was a communist and had the name of the communist lawyer. And I think it's very important that you ask these questions that you have on your mind, and I will give you my research information, not my opinion, but what I have actually documented. And you can call the station, as we said before, write a postcard, and I'll answer, because the same week that this call came, there was an article in Life magazine, this last issue of February the 4th, and it has a picture of two young people, and it says, no use for illusions. And I'm going to read the first two paragraphs of the article. The top heading said, in quotes, they were children during the wild storms of the 60s that are finishing high school. Now they are wary of almost everything, of protest, experiments with drugs, sex, communes. They want security, stability, and material comfort. It begins...
The American dream.
The American dream. They cannot remember a time when there was no Vietnam War. They were 8 when John F. Kennedy was shot, and some of them recall it with eerie precision because of the depth to which it disturbed the adults in their world. The assassination signaled the atmosphere in which they would grow up, an atmosphere of violence and suddenness in which unforeseen events could wipe out what seconds before was certainty. But at 14 or 15, sex then became an issue in their relationships. They lived through everything, if not directly, vicariously through television. The Chicago Convention riots, starting of communes, sensitivity trainings at Esalen, the killing at Kent State. And now they are 16 and 17, and they're ready for material comfort. Now, end quote. Now, I meet a lot of young people and young adults and speak around this nation. I'm beginning to speak at more groups. I've been invited to talk to the Lions Club this week, at another Mothers for Peace, and the Human Rights Day at the Monterey College. I'm going around, and I see people, young, old, establishment, who feel that the 60s and 70s aren't out of us yet. And Life magazine is trying to tell you, we survived this. Every week there's an article telling us, now that you've made it through the turbulence, you can relax and get back to normal. And I don't want you to be what they call normal, which is to accept cold-blooded killings and lobotomies and electronic warfare and napalm, which happened last night and the night before. That isn't normal. They tell you that's normal, and you don't have to protest. So I'm glad that this young fellow called me. I hope all of you who have questions, don't worry.
I can recall just this past week, I don't have an FM radio in my car, so the only radio stations I can get are AM stations. So driving to and from work, I generally listen to KGO a lot, the talk shows. And Dunbar, one morning this past week, had a call from a gentleman who was referring to some guest that Dunbar had on his TV show. And I didn't see the TV show, so I don't know the context, but my point is the statement the guy made. He said, now that woman is a communist, there's no doubt about it. You'll see, in a couple of years or so, they're going to pick her up, and that'll prove it. She's a communist.
That'll prove that she's a communist.
And this was really, this man was very sincere. That was his reality on life. If they pick her up, then that proves she was a communist.
Like in Nazi Germany. If they say you were a communist, then clear them away. You're an enemy of the state. That's right. Well, I'm glad that this fellow called, and I want you all, if you have any questions in your mind of what you were told when you were the age that they're describing now or later in years, wherever curiosity you have, if you have a question to answer, I'll always answer it. Now, this week we had an article that Dr. Leary is facing expulsion. Governor Reagan is working very hard to get Timothy Leary sent to this country and back into prison.
Why?
Well, Timothy Leary got a 10-year term for possessing marijuana. But the oppressors in our society stop at nothing to put down those people who have related to the youth or helped free them from some of the binds that they had in the past. Timothy Leary is wanted all over the globe, and they're going to track him down. So I brought in an article from the Monterey Herald, June 27th, 1968, when Jim Garrison had a trial in New Orleans and wanted to say that Clay Shaw was part of a conspiracy to murder. 4 or 5 of the people in New Orleans that he wanted fled to other states. Jim couldn't have a trial. People say, what happened in New Orleans? Well, Sergio Casio Smith went to Texas, and Conley, who was the governor, wouldn't let him go to New Orleans. And Gordon Novell said, well, I'm a CIA man, and I don't have to stand trial. So he went to Ohio, and the governor there wouldn't let him stand trial. So in 1968, Jim Garrison wanted to interview Edgar Eugene Bradley, who he said was a West Coast business representative for Dr. Carl McIntyre, the religious leader, and that there were charges that he was in Texas seen in front of the book depository at the time of the assassination, and that Roger Craig, one of the sheriffs, saw Bradley on the steps of the book depository. And Bradley said that wasn't possible. He was on a bus between Tulsa and El Paso, Texas, which shows that Bradley was not in California.
Yeah.
And somebody recognized him, knew him, and saw him at the book depository. So Ronald Reagan refused extradition for that trial. If Bradley was innocent, he would have come back home. But he was wanted on a charge of conspiracy to murder. And Reagan refused to extradite Bradley on a murder charge.
Mm-hmm.
But he's getting the government to force Leary back here on a marijuana possession, and using all of the money and $1 million in a court trial. And he sent guards over there. They squeezed him out of Algeria. They had to buy up practically all the gas of Algeria for a Texas company in order to move Cleaver on, and chase him around the world. They'll be moving him out now, and they're going to get Leary, and they'll go to no end and have these lengthy trials.
And Leary is wanted for mere possession, whereas Governor Reagan would not allow a man who had taken refuge in California to be extradited on a charge of conspiracy to murder.
That's right. Now we're going...
And that's why Jim Garrison never had a trial, and never put together any kind of a case, is because all the key witnesses had done just this, gone to various other states.
Or were killed.
And the governors of those states wouldn't extradite them.
That's right. You see,
But then, the people who want to discredit Garrison are able to say, well, see, he didn't have any case. If he did, he'd have put it together, and he'd have come to court, and he would have proven his charges. But he couldn't do that because of people like Governor Reagan refusing to extradite this man. And so
now you get the picture.
Yeah,
How can you have a case if they're all protected?
And if that is Governor Reagan's attitude, if he were consistent in that attitude, well, you could say, well, that's just the way Governor Reagan sees things. However, that's not the way Governor Reagan sees things, because he wants to extradite Timothy Leary and is spending a great deal of money to get Leary extradited back here so he can throw him back in prison.
And not even on a murder charge.
And it's not even a serious charge.
That's right, if he didn't believe in that at all. But he fought tooth and nail and kept Bradley here. If a murder charge, you can let a person go there. The jury, the 12 jury in New Orleans wouldn't say Bradley was involved in a conspiracy if they didn't think he was. And if Garrison could have had all his witnesses when he arrested Clay Shaw, he had a lot of witnesses, but they all disappeared. And they never were allowed to go back. They went into the key states that are controlled, that were involved in the assassination, and then they're not allowed to go back for the trial. How can you have a trial? That makes Jim Garrison look like a fool.
Of all something I flashed on at the beginning of this program when you were talking about the fears of your family, for your life or your welfare and all that, one of the names that we haven't mentioned very often when we're talking about the great number of people who have been killed, there was a great deal of suspicion, at least suspicion, surrounding the death of Louis Lomax, author and television and radio personality from Los Angeles. And he became involved in assassination research.
Yes, he didn't care about who killed John Kennedy, but he did care about Martin Luther King.
When Martin Luther King was killed, then he started
Lomax's car was overturned and he was killed. Now this week, Bob, I have an article here that I think is one of the most important documents to come up, or a thing that I'm putting together in my research, and I'm going to share it with you because it was in the newspapers in the Monterey Herald, and I'm going to show how I go back into my filing system. Just like the article on the extradition of Leary this week, I go back to 1968 in June and pull out the Reagan extradition of Bradley, or where he wouldn't extradite him.
To show that he was not too consistent.
But through the years, by my cross-filing articles and putting them into their chronological order, and they should be indexed, it would be wonderful if I could get volunteer help of students and people to help me index my articles, which should be done and put into computers someday. But the Monterey Herald had an article in the paper, and the San Jose Mercury and the Los Angeles Times carried this. I take 8 papers a day. They carried the story I'm going to read to you. The San Francisco Chronicle didn't carry it. The article in our newspaper up here says, Coroner's aide held as a fraud. And I'm going to read you the quotes. In Los Angeles, a deputy Los Angeles County medical examiner for 3.5 years, with neither a medical degree nor a physician's degree, authorized documents and said that he belonged to the coroner's staff, that he was a doctor, and he also said he had a legal degree. And his name is Donald Angus Stewart, 50 years old. He came to Los Angeles July 1968, 1 month after the autopsy of Robert Kennedy. And the doctor who did the autopsy on Robert Kennedy was Thomas Noguchi, the head coroner. The authorities have said that the felony perjury starts from the testimony that Stewart gave in Civil Service Commission hearings on the Noguchi in 1969, since Stewart claimed himself to be an expert medical witness. Now, it turns out that Stewart never practiced medicine in his life, that he had been through various hospitals in Chicago, the Bahamas, and Florida without a license.
He had no license. He had no medical degree.
He came with a law degree and a medical degree. He didn't have either one. That's right. And he became on the staff of the coroner's office in Los Angeles. And it turned out that what he was doing, he was a year after the autopsy of Robert Kennedy. Thomas Noguchi was discredited and fired from the county coroner's office. And I saved all the articles on Noguchi because it fits in with the Robert Kennedy murder. So I went to my files of 1969 under Robert Kennedy to see if I saw the name of Donald Angus Stewart. And Noguchi was fired for various charges. They made a list of charges: that he was crazy, mentally ill, glassy-eyed, used drugs, he was bizarre, he danced around bodies, he liked to be famous, he was waiting for Kennedy to arrive because he said, I hope he dies, and if he dies, I'll have an international reputation. He hoped a helicopter would crash. They said he did a dance of reincarnation of Dante's Inferno and said, isn't it nice, because a helicopter crashed and the bodies were coming to the coroner's office. The witnesses said he prayed for air crashes and collisions. Well, it turned out that Dr. Thomas Noguchi had gone through medical school, was a certified doctor, gave an autopsy on Robert Kennedy, and he got a certificate from the Board of Supervisors in the County of Los Angeles for the excellent autopsy. 3 doctors were present. They thought it was a complete autopsy. The autopsy read that Robert Kennedy was shot 1 inch from the back of the head and had powder gun wound at the back of the head. And I thought that the reason Noguchi had been discredited, or they tried to fire him, was that they didn't like the autopsy he did on Robert Kennedy. And if the truth came out where the gunman was in relationship to that bullet,
then they'd know it was not Sirhan.
Then Sirhan couldn't have fired the fatal bullet, and they could say, well, Noguchi was crazy at the time of the autopsy. Well, Noguchi got a good lawyer, Godfrey Isaac, who's now the attorney for Sirhan, who took each one of the witnesses in the county coroner's office and board of supervisors who was slamming him down and showed how they would recommend him for promotions, how he was doing a good job, and what he was doing in a county coroner's job was a perfectly sane position, and they were trying to make him insane. And I came across an article that, in addition to the Robert Kennedy murder, you see, his autopsy was shedding light, and he was interviewed when they fired him from the position of the coroner. He fought back. He said, I'm not going to take it lying down. I'm going to fight back. And he was asked certain questions about the Robert Kennedy assassination, how at the time of Sirhan's trial he couldn't bring out the evidence he wanted, and the judge shut him up, and he couldn't talk about the wound in the neck. And he thought that maybe the repression coming on it had something to do with that. But there was another article I have found called New Information About the County Coroner's Office. And this is the most important article of all. In the Dr. Stewart, who wasn't a doctor, arrived in Los Angeles in 1968, 1 month after the Robert Kennedy murder. And he's been working there for 3 years until they caught him this last week, that he was a fake and a perjurer. Dr. Stewart was in charge of the Coroner Inquest Department, and every killing of the Black Panthers, or black people, he was writing justifiable homicide. He was placed in the coroner's office, and Noguchi was exposing him and saying, here's an article, new information about the case, in quotes, in the Deadweiler case 4 years ago, in which a black man was shot by an L.A. cop under extremely questionable circumstances, the coroner's inquest quickly ruled justifiable homicide. And Noguchi, who was not coroner then, but working in the coroner's office, disputed the finding of justifiable homicide. Again, in the Leonard case, in which a Black Panther was shot by the police, and the recent Bode case, in which another black man was shot by the police while he sat in a car in the front of his home, Noguchi was extremely disturbed and said that Dr. Donald Stewart, Deputy Medical Examiner and Chief Inquest Hearing Officer, ruled all of these cases justifiable homicide too fast without evidence, and Stewart has been one of Noguchi's chief antagonists. In other words, the county coroner is saying these were murders by the police department, and a man with no license, evidently he is an agent of our government who is placed in the Los Angeles area to systematically kill black people, who has no medical degree and no law degree, and a doctor is saying these are cold-blooded murders. So what they tried...
Well, then every case that he's ruled on should be reopened.
Well, this is why I want a tape of this show sent to several of the people of the news media in Los Angeles, and I think that the black people down there, and I'm doing this very seriously and clearly, the black leaders in Los Angeles should demand to see every homicide case since 1968, July 68, and they should examine the evidence of whether the man was like sitting in his car, and individually each family should sue the Los Angeles Police Department and charge them with murder, as well as we'll go into that special...
Well, here again, it would be very difficult to round up the evidence, especially any physical evidence that might be involved, because in a case as important as the Robert Kennedy case, there's missing evidence, there's missing weapons, there's...
But you see what happens here. If you get, like up in San Jose, and we talked about this in September of this year, when this John Smith, the IBM chemist, a black man with a doctor's degree, a chemist working at IBM, was shot at 4 in the morning by Officer Woolley and 2 plainclothes men who had been out on a drinking spree for 16 hours. They took a man on so-called traffic citation. There were 3 there. They let the dogs out and bit him. His body was filled with wounds. He was hit on the head with flashlight. He had mace in 2 eyes. And Officer Woolley got off on the grounds that the man used profanity. You see, that he used profanity. We could go into that.
That's grounds for immediate execution.
And Chief of Police of Murphy came right in the very first day and said it was justifiable homicide. While the jury was out this week deciding the fate of Officer Woolley, Evelyn Younger appointed Chief of Police Murphy to his special promotion of attack squad. And the lawyer defending Woolley came from San Diego. Now, you put this together, we don't know if the coroners or the policemen even have the degrees they say they have in this state. If a city like Los Angeles has the black people aroused because they're sitting in a car and they're shot, and a man says it's a justifiable homicide and he doesn't have a degree from any institution.
Wasn't he asked to give references or anything, like I know that when I've applied for jobs just about anywhere, from the time I was very young, if I applied for a job as a dishwasher or a waiter in a restaurant or something, I had to give references.
Well, this is one...
And there was some check made to find out whether indeed I had ever worked in a restaurant before I'd be hired.
That's right. This is one of the most... It's the largest city in the United States outside of New York, and it's one with problems like Watts and racial problems piling up. You have people charging one group of people saying oppression, we're being systematically killed, and therefore, it would be important if the sole man in charge of deciding whether it's justifiable or not is a total fraud. You have to say, in my research, I say that there's a network of conspiracy that links over the country. So when I find this evidence, it makes my work more valid because I know what's happening, and I know that our intelligence agencies were set up originally to gather information on groups of people that could be a danger to our country, whether in another nation or in our own cities. But they're not set up to systematically kill. I brought in the issue.
Well, let's just ask the average listener, do you think that if you went to Los Angeles and applied for a position as deputy coroner, and let's assume that you have no medical degree, no medical background, that you have no license to practice, do you think you would be considered for that job?
Well, let me put it this way. In our own local community, because I'm talking about problems which people think are too far away from them, like New York or Washington or Jamaica or Los Angeles. In our own local community, a man came here several years ago to become deputy coroner of Monterey County. And his name is Mr. Shaw. I understand he just resigned about a month or two ago. I don't think he was in the coroner's office at the time. And he's from Army Intelligence. His whole background was in the social section of the Monterey Herald, the War College in Germany, his period of service, and it says it, Army Intelligence. The Monterey Herald had an article about a recipe that his wife was giving and cooking, famous people on the peninsula, and the county coroner isn't a medical man at all. And if the head medical man is away on a weekend, and if there's a murder on this peninsula, suicide, like going off Rocky Point, all these hippies, or drugs, and you say they overdose of drugs, or anything that you want to wipe somebody out, a man from Army Intelligence is your coroner in this Monterey Peninsula. That doesn't make sense to me, why that man should have the decision. If somebody murders me, for my research, they can just say, well, she commits suicide. If they don't want me to do the research, he would make the decision if he were still there. And who replaces him? I don't know who replaced him. They haven't advertised that. Is he Army Intelligence too? That doesn't make sense. We're talking about our local community, and I keep an envelope. I told you I have 1,800 subjects of current things, and you have to keep one on who are the coroners in these cities. Now, I have the one about Mr. Shaw. I think it's interesting that he was a deputy county coroner here. And then when I read that a man goes into the city of Los Angeles and wants to say that these are cold-blooded murders or justifiable homicide, it's terrible. But then what do? They hit Noguchi and begin to make him insane. And what Noguchi said...
Well, they totally discredited Noguchi, I think.
Many times we've talked about mind control, and this is the problem. What Noguchi said was in the 50s, they used to make you think to be a communist was to discredit you, the scare. And now they try to say that you're insane. So Noguchi took every point that they tried to charge about his insanity, and he showed who said it and challenged them right down the line, and came out, was reappointed a coroner. The head of the county coroner of Los Angeles was reinstated. And now, 3 years later, Mr. Stewart is out. I brought an article from June 1969 from the Los Angeles Times, in quotes, 4 accused of false testimony on Noguchi. And in the article it says, Isaac, that's Noguchi's attorney, said that Dr. Donald A. Stewart, the county's acting inquest officer, absolutely equivocally lied about a capsule test he conducted in order to determine what kind of drugs Noguchi was allegedly taking. End quotes. Now, in 1969, they referred to him as a doctor who absolutely unequivocally lied about a coroner in Los Angeles. Can you imagine what he would do on a black case? Or why he was sent into the area if a lawyer can say that about him against Dr. Noguchi? And Noguchi identified, you see, he was a young teenager at the time of the last war. And at the trial, they said, well, if he was a Japanese, he was at Pearl Harbor looking through the periscope, at the ships, and they accused him of being a Japanese traitor. And Godfrey Isaac said he was 14 years old, and his family was taken to the internment camps in California. And the reason he didn't accept the firing was that he and his wife decided, we're going to stand up against this system.
Okay, well, now all this goes back to what I was referring to, the points to that we've been talking about is that there are a great number of cases where deaths have occurred under rather suspicious conditions, and if the official reports on these deaths indicate that everything was up and up, in some cases they'll say it's justifiable homicide, in other cases they'll say it was suicide or accidental death or something like that. What this points out is you can't always trust these official proclamations, these official findings. But we have been so conditioned to accept them that the man on the street generally will say, would your government lie to you, or something to that effect.
And if somebody wants to show that the person, the official in quotes, is not telling the truth or doing a job that he shouldn't be doing, then they discredit him by saying he's crazy and fire him. And it's only because Noguchi has guts, or that I have guts. It took him 3 years to find that the man wasn't anything at all. But it takes years. But maybe all of our information can be passed on to other people now. So any other justifiable homicides, they will have to go in to the civil service requirements of certain positions of power and demand that people go into the degrees before you accept the conclusion.
Well, I'm sure you've had this laid on you. I'm sure a great many of our listeners will start talking to their friends about some of the things they've heard you say on this program, and their friends will say, well, where'd you hear that? And I say, well, this Mae Brussell, who was on KLRB, said such and such and so and so. Well, she must be nuts. And it's only a couple of conversations later that it turns out that it's just an absolute established fact that Mae Brussell is a total ding-a-ling, and that you don't know what you're talking about. And these people, a great number of them, a great number of them have never even heard the program, much less are totally unaware of the volumes and volumes and volumes of research that you have, and the mass files of documents and proofs that you have, and the evidence that you have. They're totally unaware of that, but they'll pass judgment on you because what you're saying sounds so fantastic.
Yeah, I know. I have brought in, just to conclude that one subject, I brought in the computer and automation issue of September 1970. I've asked the Monterey Library to start taking those, and when they get them, or you can go to Monterey College, September 1970, they have an article called Patterns of Political Assassinations, How Many Coincidences Make a Plot. And then they have one on the Black Panthers and the conspiracy to kill them off, and they list all the killings and how they occurred. And they fed them into a computer and compared it to certain systems in Germany and realized that these cases are not coincidental. They listed 19 cases of the Panthers in this issue, and there's been about 20 more. But I will send to Computer and Automation this article on the killings in Los Angeles so they can begin to go into the inquest office and find out what happened.
Well, this is more or less what you've been doing. You've been compiling a lot of information, and then when a name pops up, well, you do a cross-reference on it and say, where have I heard that name before? Does he appear here? Does he appear there? You've been doing the work of an analog computer.
A little think tank.
And I think it's very interesting that this Computers and Automation was a trade magazine for people who were in the computer business. It was a scientific magazine, and I don't know where, but somewhere along the way, they started feeding some information about assassinations into these computers.
And they do it every month now.
And they came up with the same answers you were getting. The same people were showing up at the same places and all that. And somebody at this magazine got very suspicious and said, well, look, let's make a project out of this. And now here's a trade magazine called Computers and Automation, which every issue concerns itself with assassinations.
Every single issue is a complete trade magazine, except information on political assassinations are fed in. Different subjects are fed into the computer, and every month since May 1970, they have 3 or 4 or 5 pages, sometimes with 29 or 30 footnotes, of the source of the information that was put into the computer and the conclusions. So they have the political Panthers, the systematic killing of them, and I will send them the information of Los Angeles that these were, in fact, homicides, because the top coroner fought so badly with this man for saying they were justifiable when he knew they weren't, that they attempted to fire him.
Now, if people don't believe Mae Brussell because they think maybe her judgment is off or something like that, these people are approaching it purely scientifically, with an unemotional machine doing all the comparisons and the...
Well, this is what I hope I'm doing too.
Yeah, I say, but if they won't accept your word because you're a human being and they say that you're not scientific or something like that, here's something that is validating everything that you've said.
That's right.
In a very scientific way.
And
they have no bones to, they have no axes to grind or anything. They're working strictly on information and documentation and evidence.
They're adding
procedure.
up all the murders, political assassinations and murders and so forth. Last week we talked briefly about an article that was in the Los Angeles Times magazine section. It was called Journey Through the Killing Ground. And it was by Robert Blair Kaiser. And we talked about, he wrote the book RFK Must Die. and he had a 4-page article in the Los Angeles Times putting down any idea of the conspiracy and calling the researchers crazies. But I wanted to bring in today information because Mr. Kaiser, it reveals himself in his biography that precedes the article. It tells you a bit about Robert Kaiser. And I once started a book called How to Kill a President, and it had 28 sections. I may still do it someday. And there's a link. I'm drawing of a link of a chain. Every link has to fit together, else the chain doesn't hold together. The assassination plot would fall apart if one link was weak. And one of the important links in that is the control of the media. And in this country, there's one branch of the media we're going to get down today, and that's Life magazine that I want to talk about. Because if you don't control the New York Times and Life magazine, you couldn't successfully get away with a political assassination. Because the saying one picture is worth 1,000 words is important. And Henry Luce, along with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, was probably the most important man in affecting minds in America through life and time of any publication in the world has ever affected foreign affairs or policies. And in the introduction of his article, putting down assassination conspiracies, Robert Kaiser tells you that he was a writer in Arizona. First he was a Jesuit priest. For 10 years he studied the priesthood. And then he was writing in Phoenix, Arizona, and Claire Booth Luce, he said, admired his work. And she introduced him to her husband. And in due course, Kaiser became he'd been writing 5 years with Time magazine. Now, in order to please Claire Luce in Arizona, that tells you in the first place where Robert Kaiser's head is at. I don't have to tell you much more, you know. Whittaker Chambers also worked for Time magazine, and then when Life came out, he was on the staff of Life. Claire Luce was very proud of the world as it was reported by Robert Kaiser. So she said, Henry, here's a nice young reporter. He should be on our staff. And he was there for 6 years. And then he left Time in '66 and went to work for Tom Braden's campaign, where he said, in quotes, he got thick with the Kennedy crowd. When the exposures came out on CIA foundations and conduit funds, Braden's office was right in on the top of the conduit and secret funding of youth organizations and so forth, and filtering universities. Tom Braden's whole group was filled with CIA. He went from there to Los Angeles, and this is what, in the article, his biography says. By 1968, he was a freelance writer, and he was working at his home. And in the morning after RFK's assassination, Life assigned him to the Sirhan story. And when the story came out 2 years later, he sent his copies to Arthur Schlesinger, P.N. Salinger, Teddy White, all of whom refused to read it, and sent the book back. Now, he is telling you that Life magazine sent him to Sirhan. Now, what happens? He goes into his article, which I have here, and he says, this is the way the article reads, in June '68, another Kennedy was killed. I found a way of getting to the assassin, and I took it. He found a way. We're going to go into the Zapruder film that Life magazine bought the day of the assassination and loaned to the Warren Commission, minus a few shots and pictures altered and so forth. Life loaned the Warren Commission their copy of the Zapruder film, the only movies they were to use of the grassy knoll. So Kaiser found a way to get to the Sirhan, you see. And he said, I wanted to know more and more than I thought the officials would tell. So this is quotes, Robert Kaiser. So I talked with the assassin. I talked with him 2 or 3 times a week for 7 months. I went into the cell with his psychiatrist. I tape recorded his sessions with them, even his sessions under hypnosis, and I found that the assassin, Sirhan, could not remember killing Kennedy, and that his declared motives didn't make sense. I was in the police department with him. He says neither the Federal Bureau of Investigation nor the Los Angeles Police Department were allowed to talk to the assassin. And listen to this. I mean, you know, when I came in the station, I had KLRB on the radio, and they had Winnie the Pooh on. I loved it, you know, because I have FM in my car. And I offered to bring my Alice in Wonderland in. You know, I have the full recording of the reading of Alice in Wonderland. And I offered to bring that in. They could play parts of that. I'm reading like Alice in Wonderland. Life magazine lets this man in, his most confidential, with his psychiatrist he should be alone, Sirhan, the criminal and the psychiatrist. Since when does this third person from Life magazine sit in the most personal moments with the psychiatrist and his client? And the L.A. Police Department, he said the L.A. Police Department and the FBI had to reproduce their reconstruction of the event because he said they weren't allowed to talk with the assassin. End quotes right there, because I don't want to get too angry or emotional about this. I really get angry because just think about this man in that cell with that psychiatrist. He had access to documents that nobody else had. I brought an article here, a lawsuit going on in Washington, and this is the basis of my refusal to pay the taxes or to recognize Richard Nixon as the president until I get this information. This lawsuit in Washington, the right of equal access to government information. It was placed by Bernard Fensterwald and the Committee to Investigate Assassinations against the Justice Department because Robert Kaiser had access to FBI reports and documents, FBI files 56 to 156. He had information that no one else in the United States government has, and if he's merely a journalist,
a freelance writer,
and other people have been working on political assassinations for 5 years up to that day and have document after document, we can't get them, and this is a lawsuit pending, which we've mentioned on the air many times. So Life sent him in to that room. Now, I'm going to say, what role did Life play in the John Kennedy murder? Because I'm telling you what happened in the Sirhan. In the first place, the minute the murder took place, Mr. Zapruder was standing on the street, and he sold his movie to Life magazine between, it said either $25,000 to $1 million, no one's sure. It went right into their hands, and Zapruder never saw it again. And I realized, I have a list of all the other photographers that were on the street that day, that he was to be the official government photographer, that they were not to use the other cameras, because people on the street, these were the men whose films were documented and played slowly and cross-filed for computer and automation. Mrs. Nix, Mrs. Muchmore, Mr. Hughes, Mr. Martin, Mr. Bell, Mr. Algens, Mrs. Moorman, Mr. Willis, Mr. Wigman, Rickerby, Mr. Couch, Mrs. Bond, Mr. Dorman, Mr. Dillard, and Mr. Weaver. All were on the grassy knoll. That's 12 or 14 people. No camera was used to look at their film of the assassination.
They had pictures.
Oh, yeah, they had thousands
each one of these people you mentioned.
Of feet. It was the most photographed killing of a president. And the Warren Commission didn't use any of their pictures. And I have a chart here, Bob. I wish the people could see it, where these people were standing. And the researchers have looked at their films to see what they could see on the grassy knoll. They see people being taken away by the police, and the police had no suspects later. But Life magazines took the Zapruder film, the famous Zapruder film, and they loaned it to the Warren Commission. The second thing Life magazine did was they gave Marina Oswald $5,000, and they published the cover of Lee Oswald holding a rifle and a gun right away. This is the assassin, this is the rifle and gun. Lee saw the negative before he was killed, and he said, I didn't have a gun, and that's my head, it's not my body. If you look at the body, they did a funny thing. They put some blue jeans on, and the pockets are backwards, and the pants are backwards. It's sort of a comical thing, and the researchers know now who the man's body was, that Lee's head was put on. But Life magazine took those negatives that were in the possession of Mrs. Payne and Mrs. Oswald, and they superimposed it. That picture caused consternation all over Europe because the shadows of the nose came straight down over his mouth where the sun would be. But where the body and the rifle go, the shadows of the rifle went in back, so the sun was at a different position.
Was in front of him, yeah.
But Life magazine told the whole world, see, one picture is worth 1,000 words or images. It took the place of words. Lee holding the rifle, one hand, a pistol in the other hand, and the militant communist paper coming out of his pocket. If there isn't anything incriminating about that, and they did that. Life magazine published the diary of Lee Harvey Oswald and gave Marina $20,000 for it. The spelling was wrong. The minute I got that issue of Life, I knew it was contrived. Every word was spelled wrong. In the same paragraph, he spelled the same word 3 different times. It was the kind of a way that they would imagine a deranged person would write. But in the Warren Commission documents, you have letters he writes to the State Department from Minsk to Washington, Minsk to Moscow, and Minsk to Texas. nothing is spelled that way.
Very articulate.
Very articulate.
Grammatically correct. The construction is correct.
But they made, and then Marina, under testimony, admitted that the diary was contrived for a purpose, but she was never really pressed how that diary was conceived or fingerprinted to see if he wrote it. No, they never fingerprinted the diary to see if his handwriting was on it. You see that he wrote it. Life magazine.
Did they ever have a handwriting analyst come in and compare it to other?
Oh, no, nothing. They never checked out the validity of the diary, and Life magazine could tell the whole world for, was it 35 cents in those days? Now it's 50 cents.
Well, this is the kind of thing that really blows your mind, that just about any amateur photographer could look at that photograph that was on the cover of Life magazine and tell you that it was a composite, that it was a phony photograph.
All of Europe talked about it, but the American press didn't get as much play.
Now, don't you think that Life magazine should have some kind of charges brought against it,
I brought
for
in
publishing a thing like that, because you know that their photography editor is a good photographer, and you know that he would recognize a phony picture when he saw it, but he allowed it to go through, and it went on the cover of Life magazine, and it purported to be a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald, a legitimate photograph of him, to all the nation at a crucial time in our history, and yet nothing has been said about it to this date.
No, the Warren Commission, right away when they charged it was a fake picture, fake, the head superimposed, the Warren Commission had to account for that, so they took an agent by the name of Mr. Schoenfeld and put him out in the yard where Oswald was supposed to have taken the picture, and they have a photograph of him with his head off, saying the shadows could have been this way. They couldn't wait. They couldn't wait till April, where the sun was in the same position. If it was taken in April 63, they could have waited till April 64. The Warren report didn't come out until September 64. They could have duplicated the exact season and taken to show the world that those shadows could come that way, but it wouldn't work out that way. See, they had, the time was in their favor, you see. If the Warren reports come out in September and the picture is taken in November, you'd say we can't wait that long. But here they're reproducing it and can't make the shadows work. So Life magazine has a cover image of Lee Oswald with this communist literature. They have a cover image of pages on the diary.
They have a diary that a government witness, Marina Oswald, said was contrived,
That's
which
right.
was accepted into evidence without any research being made as to the handwriting or, well, no expert testimony was even requested.
That's right. I'm going to run down and maybe we'll read them if we have time. I want to talk about Life magazine. The night of the assassination at 6 o'clock, Marguerite Oswald said that they arrived at the home of Mrs. Payne, where Marina was living, and 5 minutes later, the Life magazine people were there, and Mrs. Payne said, "Oh, come on in. I was expecting you. I hope you brought color film." And Margaret Oswald was just furious. Her son was charged with murdering the president, and Marina was being the hostess. Then at 9 o'clock, they went down to visit Lee Oswald at the jail, and Life magazine took Marguerite and Marina down to the jail. Then they said, "Well, you're not comfortable at Mrs. Payne's. You're crowded." So Life magazine paid the bill and took them to the Inn of Six Flags for several days and took care of that tab. An article for Time magazine about the assassination of Mrs. Payne's was written by Jessamine West. That's Nixon's cousin, his first cousin who did that. Life magazine took the films of a man named Mr. Rocco, this is in volume 26, page 496, who knew Ruby for 2 years, and he was writing articles on various nightclubs and performers, and he went into the nightclub of Ruby's in November 63 and took some pictures of the interior of the Carousel Club. And Life magazine got the negatives from him, and he could never see them again. And he said that they were threatening to sue him if he talked about the subject. He's not to show any of these pictures or make any comments. And he had taken pictures inside the club, and he thought maybe one of them was Oswald, but he wasn't sure. But Life magazine has those negatives in their possession, and no one can have them. Mr. Rocco is a man who talks about nightclubs all over the country, who innocently was inside Ruby's club.
Life never published those photographs.
No one has seen them. Life has those photographs.
And they probably spent a good amount of money for them.
Then when Mrs. Payne was asked right after the assassination, well, do you think Lee Harvey Oswald did it? And Alan Dulles asked her before the Warren Commission, what did you think, that Oswald was guilty? And Mrs. Payne said, well, it's difficult. She says, when the police asked me, I didn't think he had done it. There was doubt in my mind, and I didn't see, what was happening. But it seems that the circumstantial evidence is powerful to me. She said, I went down and I saw all the diagrams that were showed to me by Life, and they seemed accurate. I mean, this is where Lee Harvey Oswald was living. Her husband, we went last weekend to Michael Payne. He's a designer of helicopters out at Bell Aerospace. We can't go every weekend into the background. These people, Life magazine convinced her that Oswald did it. Life, again, and then when it came time to reproduce, what happened was Life had pictures of the negatives, and Warren Commission called them on it because the FBI expert testified that the picture of Oswald holding the rifle was retouched. In February 21st, the FBI said that the negatives had been retouched. And the Western Union and Life magazine had a correspondence, and they sent back an answer saying that we're aware that the picture that appeared in Europe had a telescopic sight and that we had retouched it out. See, the first pictures that Life had of Oswald holding the gun, it had a telescopic sight, and it was supposed to have been taken in April '63. So Life admitted that they printed it without the sight because the day of the assassination, a man in Irving, Texas, named Mr. Ryder said, oh, in November '63, Oswald was in my shop and I attached a sight onto the gun. See, so then that means that the picture taken in April didn't have the sight. So Life and Newsweek admitted that they wiped out the sight of the original pictures. Then 24 hours later, Klein's in Chicago said that gun was offered from us and it had a sight on it. So they reprinted the picture with the sight on. In volume 21, from page 449 to 457, if you go into the library, you can see the documents. Newsweek said to the Warren Commission in June 24th, I'm informed by our editors that the photograph they received was poor in quality and it was retouched to improve for reproduction. In retouching at Newsweek, the technician inadvertently brushed out the telescopic sight, which we have since had occasion to not see was visible, but only barely in the original. It says, of course, there was no intention to alter the substance of the photograph.
Well, any retoucher who does something like that just starts back and starts over again, makes a new negative, and corrects his mistake. He doesn't allow it to be printed.
Well, it went all over.
What appears to me is, okay, say Life magazine were really sincere and straight and out front about the whole thing. If they had a photograph and they said, well, wait a minute, this photograph doesn't fit the evidence,
they would hold on to the photograph.
Then being in the news media, they should say, I wonder if there's something wrong with the evidence because we have a photograph here that doesn't match that evidence. No, what they did was they altered the photograph so that it would fit the evidence.
And then when the evidence changed, they altered the photograph again. That's right. They block out things, they make them lighter or darker.
Well, without speculating about motives or anything, that does seem a strange thing for a national publication to do.
It is totally wrong. It is, we can talk about, we won't talk about motives. If a picture has a scope and taken in April, and the scope turned out to be attached in November at Mr. Ryder's, look for some other gun or look for another person. You can't keep altering the picture to fit the man. This is what they did with famous Bullet 399. We're going to do a show in March on that when Mr. Cutler comes out. He's a professor at a university back east, and he's going to be here visiting. I mean, he's done a lot of work for computer and automation. And he's written a book called Two Flight Paths on the famous bullet that was supposed to have done all the damage. And he'll show you how they can change everything as it goes along if it doesn't fit the original thesis.
Well, on the other hand, nowadays we have some magazines such as Earth magazine. I wanted to bring this up because you outraged a lot of people early in this series when you suggested the possibility, and Dick Gregory has mentioned it also, that perhaps our government is responsible for a lot of the heroin that's coming into this country. And just last week, in their current issue, Earth magazine
documents this fact.
Brought out a very well-documented story of the CIA bringing opium and heroin into this country through machinations that involved their ownership of an airlines.
But see, I think
and there was a press conference in San Francisco this past week
made a big fuss
in which an ex-CIA employee testified that he witnessed this happening. He witnessed the planes being loaded and all that sort of thing. I didn't see anything on United Press about that.
Or Associated Press. No, you see, I don't deny that we need intelligence information in this world. But, again, we are supposed to be gathering intelligence. We're not supposed to be bringing drugs into the country to make the blacks and the youth a bunch of zombies. The older people aren't going to fight the system, and you zog out the young ones, and what do you have left? I think that we have to get some sanity back into the systems that are set up and weed out people like this Dr. Stewart in Los Angeles or the airplanes that are bringing opium in.
And the reason the older people aren't going to fight the system is because through working hard within the system, they have achieved a certain amount of security and comfort and all the things that this article that you began the program with was talking about. Now the young people are more concerned about comfort and security and a good, strong financial basis.
Just trust us. That's right.
Yeah, and they're all completely finished with the '60s and the violence and all the disturbances, and nobody's going to be disturbed anymore because we're going to have plenty.
And actually, we're more violent than ever.
Yeah. But as long as the individual feels that his life and his security isn't threatened, so long as he plays the game,
he's going to be quiet.
He's going to be fine. He's going to be just fine.
Well, this is what my family says. You know, America's good to you, and it's the best possible of all countries, and I agree with both of those points. You know, America is the best country, and it has been good to me. But we cannot systematically murder innocent people in our society and drug them and think that the country's going to remain good. I want a strong America. And
you want to keep a good America.
I want to keep a good America. And if we are doing these things, I want to expose who's doing it so that we have a strong youth who can face a difficult situation or a murder and say, I see what happened, and go on from there, hopefully to prevent a succession of murders, see? Ted Kennedy says, I can't run, I'd be killed. Everybody knows he'd be killed. Computer Automation had an article, if McGovern ran, he'd be killed. What kind of a country is this, even though we survived the past, that we have to look through the future of either having Humphrey or Muskie or Nixon for president? There's other people in this nation to choose from. I could listen, they are selected for us, and I want to show that anybody who has the guts or courage to face the real issues will be killed, and I want that machinery of killing stopped so we can face the real issues. Now, before we close, I want to tell everybody to do a little homework between now and when we meet next week. Esquire magazine, March, this issue, has an article, Are You Sure Who Killed Martin Luther King? You know, when we started on the year in June, I was saying that the assassinations would be the most important thing of 72 to come out. And I want you to read the article on Are You Sure Who Killed Martin Luther King? And next week, we'll do one whole show, hopefully, on just James Ray and Martin Luther King. And I think you're going to have a surprise when you read this article about who is accused. One man, Mr. Stoner, the white racist in the South, was offered $25,000 by the FBI to kill King. And he wouldn't, because then they could pin it to him. You see, if it comes from the top down, you can't pin it on anybody. They have to do their own murders with their own agents. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Haynes, the attorney for James Ray, who was fired because he was a former FBI man, and he's a very responsible man. And they said specifically, who do you think did it? And he feels that it either was a black racist group of the CIA, and he tells you why. He thinks it's one of those organizations, and you know which one I think it was. And Mr. Haynes is a conservative white man who represents the racist kind of person in the South most of the time, and they are outraged at what's going on with the Martin Luther King, and both say that James Ray didn't fire the gun and didn't kill him, that the gun that was registered to James Ray, he bought. A bullet was in Martin Luther King. It killed him. The gun and the bullet don't match.
And James Earl Ray his lawyer pleaded guilty for him, I think.
Well, Haynes was knocked out of the case because he wanted to say it was a conspiracy. So